7,000 fallen bodies of Romans lie sprawled across the plains of Heraclea, creating a grim tapestry of death and destruction. Among these fallen, 4,000 are the very best of Greece's warriors, valiant soldiers whose bodies are now silent witnesses to a brutal and decisive battle. Their limbs have been hacked apart, and their shields shattered into splinters, remnants of a fierce clash that has left nothing untouched. Walking amidst this sea of corpses is the victorious general, but contrary to what one might expect, he does not wear a triumphant smile. Instead, his face is a mask carved from a calculated horror, a reflection of the grim toll of victory. This triumphant figure has just crushed the Roman legions in a head-on confrontation, a clash that has proven beyond doubt that his tactical genius surpasses even the most seasoned commanders. With this victory, he has humiliated the nascent Roman Republic, shattering their hopes and plans in a single, brutal encounter.
Yet, as he surveys the fallen officers and soldiers, those who fought bravely and fell just as valiantly, his lips part to utter a truth that will echo through the ages, a truth that encapsulates the futility of unchecked ambition, a reminder of the high cost of relentless conquest. He speaks softly, yet profoundly. Another victory like this, and I shall be lost. Welcome to the mind of Pyrrhus of Epirus, a man driven by a fierce and complex psyche. This was no ordinary warrior fighting solely for land or glory. He was battling against a ghost, a specter of endless ambition and insatiable desire. History remembers him as a figure who achieved victory, but at an overwhelming price, earning a reputation as someone who won battles, yet lost the war of his destiny. To truly grasp why this Greek king crossed the treacherous waters of the Adriatic to bleed in Italy, one must delve into the obsession that haunted his very soul, an obsession that fueled his every move and decision.
In order to comprehend the scale of the impending catastrophe, we must travel back 4 decades into history. The great conqueror Alexander the Macedonian had recently died, leaving a vast empire without a clear successor. His death created a power vacuum so immense and destabilizing that the political landscape shattered into chaos. The generals who had served under Alexander, known as the Diadochi, began to tear the empire apart with ravenous ferocity, much like wolves devouring a freshly killed carcass. Amidst this maelstrom of treachery, murder, and endless civil wars, a new figure emerged, Pyrrho. But Pyrrho was not merely a soldier or a king. He was cursed by a peculiar inheritance. A second cousin to Alexander himself, he shared not only blood, but also his very visage. This familial resemblance was a constant reminder of a destiny intertwined with greatness and tragedy, a legacy that seemed both a blessing and a curse. As we look deeper into his origins and the turbulent times that shaped him, it becomes clear that Pyrrho's life was marked by a relentless pursuit of victory, one that often came at a cost far greater than mere territory. The ancient historians of that era whispered with a mix of awe and trepidation whenever they caught sight of him. It was as if the very essence of a legendary figure had been resurrected, his mane of flowing hair, his piercing, intense gaze, and the same distinctive tilt of his neck to the left. To behold Pyrrhus was to glimpse a ghostly echo of Alexander the Great himself, as if the spirit of that ancient conqueror had been reborn and was once again walking upon the earth. Such a resemblance was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, for it seemed to carry with it the weight of history and the echoes of a divine ambition. Imagine the immense psychological pressure that must have burdened him, knowing that he was essentially the living embodiment of a godlike figure, revered and feared by many. From the moment he learned to wield a sword, the world around him demanded that he emulate Alexander's greatness, perhaps even surpass it. Pyrrhus, however, was not content to merely imitate the legendary Macedonian. He resolved to transcend him, to carve out his own empire,
and leave a mark that history would never forget. Yet, this pursuit was fraught with insurmountable obstacles. The map of the ancient world had already been mapped out by the seasoned generals who served under Alexander's legacy. Egypt, Syria, and Macedonia, the heartlands of the Macedonian conquests, had long been under the control of those veteran commanders who refused to relinquish their domains. The territories were effectively sealed, the borders firmly entrenched, and the dream of expansion seemed all but out of reach.
Meanwhile, Pyrrhus, a brilliant military strategist and tactician, found himself in a dire predicament. Although his reputation as a military genius was undeniable, he lacked a sovereign state to channel his talents and lead his armies in a grand campaign. His gaze often stretched hopelessly toward distant horizons, yearning for the opportunity to forge his own empire, to carve out a new Persia of his own making. It was during this time of longing and frustration that destiny, in its cruel wisdom, presented him with a tantalizing yet perilous proposition. In the year 281 AD, a delegation from the city of Tarentum arrived at his court in Epirus, bearing an offer that was as tempting as it was dangerous. Tarentum, a wealthy and once glorious Greek colony situated in the southern reaches of Italy, had become a city of decadence and decline, yet still wielded influence through its riches and strategic position. However, it was now trembling under the shadow of a formidable new power, an emerging force of barbarian tribes from the west, calling themselves Romans. These Romans had already begun to challenge the old Greek dominance in Italy, sinking Roman ships and humiliating their ambassadors in acts of defiance. The situation was escalating rapidly, and the Roman legions were advancing southward, their armies marching inexorably toward the Greek city-states of Italy. The Tarentines, recognizing the gravity of their predicament, did not simply extend a mercenary contract to Pyrrhus. Instead, they offered him a vision, a dream of conquest that beckoned him to cross the Adriatic Sea and challenge Rome at its very doorstep. They spun tales of hope, promising that if Pyrrhus would come to Italy and lead their armies, the local tribes, the Samnites, the Lucanians, the Brutii, would rise up en masse in support of him. They painted a picture of a united Italy rebelling against the Roman invaders, a glorious revolt that could restore Greek dominance and perhaps even change the course of history. Yet, beneath these promises lay a dangerous lie, for the true cost of such an endeavor was unknown, and the risks were immense. Pyrrhus stood at a crossroads, tempted by the promise of glory and the chance to forge his own empire, yet aware that the path ahead was fraught with peril, lined with uncertainties and the potential for ruin. He was promised an army of 350,000 infantrymen and 20,000 cavalrymen awaiting his command. Such a figure, however, was nothing more than a monumental falsehood, a fabrication so enormous that it defied reality itself. It was an impossible number, a grand illusion designed to inflate hopes and ambitions beyond plausible limits. Yet, Pyrrho, the ambitious leader, paid no heed to such logical doubts. Instead, he listened only to the siren song of glory that beckoned him. In his mind's eye, he saw Italy through the same lens that Alexander the Great had once gazed upon Asia, an uncharted expanse ripe for conquest, filled with the promise of eternal fame.
To Pyrrho, the moment was a gateway, an entry point to a vast Western empire that he aimed to forge. His plans, though seemingly absurd in their scope, were driven by an obsession with victory and dominance. He envisioned crushing Rome beneath his armies, then swiftly moving to seize Sicily, and from there launching a bold leap across the sea to capture the mighty city of Carthage. His ultimate goal was to encircle the entire Mediterranean basin, transforming himself into the master of the known world. Such an audacious vision, however, was met with silence among his court. No one dared to challenge him with the harsh reality. Rome was no Persia, no ancient empire on the brink of decay, awaiting conquest.
Persia was a venerable, aging empire, its power waning, ripe for the taking. Rome, in contrast, was a fierce, youthful hydra, vibrant, relentless, and obsessed with warfare. The Romans lacked the gleam of gold. Instead, they possessed relentless iron, an unyielding material symbolizing their resilience. They had no single emperor wielding absolute power. Rather, they were governed by consuls, elected officials who rotated annually, each seeking military glory before their term expired. This system of fleeting leadership kept their armies motivated and their ambitions high, never allowing complacency to settle in. Amidst this ambitious chaos, Cineas, Pyrrho's wisest advisor, sought to temper the leader's reckless dreams. With a simple yet devastating question, he aimed to bring Pyrrho back to the stark realities of conquest.
"My lord," he inquired softly, "if we succeed in defeating the Romans, what do we intend to do afterward?" Pyrrho's response was feverish and filled with excitement. He eagerly spoke of conquering Sicily, envisioning that conquest as the next step. Cineas pressed further, asking again what lay beyond that, prompting Pyrrho to mention Africa, and then to speak of ruling over all the Greek territories. The conversation spiraled into grandiose visions of empire, of domination stretching from continent to continent. Finally, Cineas delivered the decisive blow. After listing the endless ambitions, conquering Sicily, Africa, Greece, he asked one last time, "And after all these victories, what will you do then?" Pyrrho, with a faint smile, replied simply, "We shall rest, drink wine, and talk of philosophy." Cineas looked him directly in the eyes and delivered a sobering verdict. "My lord, we already have wine, and we can discuss philosophy right now."
Why do we need to spill so much blood to reach a point where we already stand? His words underscored the futility of endless conquest when peace and contentment might already be within reach. Pyrrhus ignores the ominous warning that looms over him. Undeterred, he begins to mobilize his formidable war machine, assembling an army of unprecedented strength and destructive potential, meticulously crafted for total annihilation. His force comprises 20,000 heavy infantry soldiers, known as phalangists, each armed with long pikes called zarizas, massive 5-meter-thick spears that, when arranged in formation, transform their ranks into an almost impenetrable hedgehog of steel and spear points. Complementing this formidable corps are 3,000 elite cavalrymen, swift and deadly on horseback, ready to outflank and outmaneuver any opposition. Additionally, 2,000 archers are prepared to unleash volleys of arrows from a distance, their precision devastating against unprotected foes. Among his most feared assets are his secret weapons, antique tanks, ancient war machines
engineered to crush and destroy. Accompanying them are 20 Indian war elephants, colossal beasts that the Romans had never encountered before. Terrifying monsters of nightmare, meticulously trained to trample enemy lines and sow chaos in their wake. These towering creatures, with their massive tusks and thunderous steps, were designed to instill terror and break the enemy's formations before they could even mount a defense. However, as the army prepares to set sail for Italy, nature itself intervenes with ruthless brutality. A violent storm erupts without warning, unleashing its fury upon the fleet. This tempest is no ordinary squall. It is a foreboding omen, a sign of the chaos to come.
The mighty ships, caught in the tempest's grip, collide and crush one another amid the tumult. Galleys, once proud vessels of conquest, are battered and sunk, taking with them hundreds of men, valiant soldiers, along with their horses, which are drowned in the merciless waters. Piro's own flagship is shattered by towering waves, battered beyond recognition in the relentless storm. In the dead of night, amid a turbulent Black Sea raging with fury, the man who aspired to be the new Alexander the Great is forced into a desperate act of survival. Clinging to the wreckage, he must plunge into the icy waters, swimming desperately toward the distant coast, amid the debris of his shattered fleet. His journey is fraught with peril, a harrowing struggle against the cold and the chaos of the storm-tossed sea. When Piro finally reaches the shores of Italy, he does not arrive as a triumphant conqueror, draped in gold and glory.
Instead, he emerges as a battered castaway, coughing and shivering from inhaling salt water, surrounded by broken wood, scattered corpses, and the wreckage of his ambitions. Of the 20 elephants that had accompanied him, only a handful survived the initial landing, their massive bodies battered but still alive. His army, once a cohesive and terrifying force, has been scattered and disorganized, an absolute logistical catastrophe. Any other leader might have turned back at this point, overwhelmed by despair and the chaos. But Piro's resolve remains unbroken. Gathering the scattered remnants of his forces, he begins the arduous process of regrouping. Slowly, he moves toward Taranto, a crucial strategic point on Italy's southeastern coast. Yet it is here, at this pivotal juncture, that harsh reality strikes for the first time, shattering the illusions of invincibility and grandeur that had fueled his ambitions. The true challenge has only just begun. As Pyrrhus entered Tarentum, he anticipated finding a formidable force of approximately 350,000 allies eager to engage in battle. Instead, what greeted him was a city immersed in celebration, a scene of revelry and festivity. The Tarentines seemed to believe that Pyrrhus would come to fight on their behalf, all the while continuing their endless banquets, theatrical performances, and carefree lifestyles. Their complacency was palpable, a stark contrast to the seriousness of the military campaign they had anticipated. Pyrrhus's reaction to this apparent indifference was swift, authoritarian, and uncompromising. Without hesitation, he ordered the closure of gyms and theaters, swiftly putting an end to the merrymaking. Fiestas and public entertainments were forbidden outright, and martial law was declared to ensure discipline and order.
The once pampered citizens, known for their talent and luxury, were swiftly conscripted into service, forced to undergo rigorous training under the strict supervision of Pyrrhus's Epirote officers, who wielded the lash to maintain control. It became painfully clear, too late, that the city's inhabitants had not summoned a savior, but had instead unwittingly invited a master, one who would wield absolute authority over them. However, There was no time to indulge in internal politics or grievances. News from the scouts arrived with alarming urgency, revealing a stark and terrifying reality. The Romans, far from being intimidated by the news of Pyrrhus's arrival, had shown no signs of retreat. Instead, they were advancing with relentless speed, moving towards the south with a force and determination that seemed almost impossible to halt. The Roman consul, Valerius Lavinius, was marching swiftly across the region, heading straight into the heart of the conflict. Their strategy was clear and aggressive. They aimed to confront Pyrrhus head-on, testing his strength and resolve. Rather than retreat to consolidate their defenses in Rome, the Romans pressed forward, crossing the rugged terrain of Lucania. Their armies were burning fields, destroying crops, and severing supply lines, all to weaken Pyrrhus's position before he could even rally his Italian allies. This was the year 280 BC, a pivotal moment in history, marking the first collision between two mighty civilizations on the plains near the river Siris. On one side stood the Macedonian phalanx, an unyielding wall of spears, a highly disciplined and rigid formation born from the legacy of Alexander the Great. This formidable military structure, renowned for its invincibility on open terrain, represented the epitome of classical warfare. The clash was imminent. Two distinct ways of fighting, two contrasting civilizations, poised to collide in what would become a defining confrontation of ancient history. On the opposite bank, the formidable Roman legion stood poised, an embodiment of brutal efficiency, highly maneuverable and supremely adaptable, yet undeniably relentless. This force was a relentless machine, a veritable grinder designed for combat across any terrain, capable of brutal assaults and swift retreats alike. As Pyrrhus approached the river's edge, he paused to survey the scene before him, eyes fixed on the enemy across the flowing waters. He observed their fortifications, meticulously constructed to withstand assault, their guards, disciplined and alert, standing like statues in perfect formation, and the unwavering rigor with which they maintained their order. It was immediately clear to him that these Romans did not resemble the chaotic, disorganized barbarians he had been led to believe. Their discipline was precise, their strategy calculated, and their readiness apparent, even from this distance. Turning to one of his generals, Pyrrhus murmured softly, a mixture of awe and trepidation in his voice. The deployment of these legions defied any notion of barbarism. What he saw was a highly trained, disciplined fighting force, more akin to a well-oiled machine than a band of savages. As dawn's first light broke over Heraclea, a golden glow spread across the battlefield. The air was thick with anticipation, yet beneath that calm surface, a heavy silence hung, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath before the impending violence. The quiet was oppressive, almost deafening, foretelling the chaos soon to erupt. Pyrrho adjusted his helmet, a flamboyant piece of armor adorned with tall plumes and curving goat horns that made him instantly visible to every soldier on his side. He knew well that today, thousands of men would meet their end amidst the bloodshed. What he could not yet grasp was that victory in this battle would mark only the beginning of his own downfall, a stepping stone on the path to ruin. Meanwhile, the Siris River roared fiercely, unleashing frothy white waves that crashed against the banks and added a ferocious soundtrack to the scene. The Roman forces did not wait for elaborate commands or seek a perfect crossing point. Instead, they launched themselves into the river with reckless abandon, shields held high, shouting war cries as the icy currents battered them at waist level. Their audacity was unyielding, a display of raw courage and tactical resolve. Meanwhile, Roman cavalry, swift and relentless, crossed along the flanks, threatening to encircle the Greek forces even before the first clash of weapons. Pyrrhus immediately recognized that he had lost the advantage of the initial surprise and initiative.
He could no longer afford to wait for his phalanx to form in its usual slow, ceremonial manner. Time was of the essence. With a decisive move, he summoned his elite cavalry, around 3,000 horsemen, and charged headlong into the river itself. The collision was brutal, an eruption of violence where steel met flesh and spear met mud. Swords clashed against lances in the muddy shallows of the riverbank, a chaotic melee of primal fury. Pyrrhus fought with unrestrained ferocity, fighting like a man possessed, leading the charge from the front lines amidst the chaos and bloodshed. Your armor gleams brilliantly, catching the sunlight with a dazzling shimmer that could easily be mistaken for a sign of invincibility. Every move you make is executed with flawless precision, showcasing your mastery in combat. Yet, that very brightness, so impressive to the eye, serves as a deadly beacon on the battlefield, an unmistakable signal of your presence, a target that enemies cannot help but fix upon.
Within the ranks of the Roman soldiers, a fierce desire burns to achieve the glory of slaying the legendary new Alexander, a hero whose reputation has already begun to echo through history. Among these warriors, a Roman cavalry captain, observing the scene unfold, sets his gaze intently upon the regal figure before him. Without hesitation, he charges forward, disregarding all else in his reckless pursuit. His charge is ferocious. He slices through the royal guard with a relentless force, forcing his way past the defenses. In a swift, decisive moment, the captain's weapon strikes true. He kills Pyrrho's horse, causing the king to tumble from his steed and fall to the ground. For a fleeting instant, the entire course of history seems to hang by a single thread, as the outcome of this pivotal encounter teeters on a knife's edge. Fortunately, the king's trusted bodyguards act swiftly, rallying to rescue their sovereign and fending off the attacking captain. They manage to eliminate the assailant, but the message is unmistakable. In Italy, even kings are not immune to mortal danger. Pyrrho, recognizing the peril, makes a strategic decision that will ultimately save his life, but at a heavy cost. In a desperate act of deception, he exchanges his armor and cloak with Megacles, one of his most trusted officers. Dressed in the king's regal attire, Megacles becomes an unwitting decoy, drawing the full fury and fire of the Roman army upon himself. As the fierce clash between the phalanx and the legions finally erupts, chaos reigns supreme on the battlefield. For hours, the two sides engage in a brutal struggle, with the Roman legions relentlessly attempting to break through the formidable wall of spears and shields. The Romans make 7 desperate attempts to shatter the phalanx, each time being repelled with ferocity, leaving behind mountains of fallen Roman soldiers, many pierced through by the deadly pikes. Despite the staggering losses, the Roman forces refuse to retreat. Instead, they regroup, rearm, and launch renewed assaults, charging once more into the thick of the carnage, trampling over the bodies of their fallen comrades in a relentless, industrial slaughter. But then, disaster strikes. Megacles, still dressed as the king, is overwhelmed and cut down. Roman soldiers seize his helmet, tearing away the regal insignia, and raise it high on a spear. Their shouts echo across the battlefield. "The king is dead! Pyrrho has fallen!" The Greek line begins to falter, wavering under the weight of this devastating blow. Panic quickly spreads among the troops, infecting the ranks with dread and chaos. The situation grows increasingly dire, and Pyrrho is faced with a moment that he could never have anticipated, an act that defies all conventional wisdom. With no other choice, he removes his own helmet, revealing his face to his troops. Spurring his horse forward, he rides into the midst of his men, exposed and unshielded, shouting commands amid the thunder of steel on steel, in a desperate bid to rally his shattered forces and stem the tide of defeat. "I am present here, standing firm. It is I." My voice halts the fleeing footsteps, marking the decisive moment of this final letter.
Pyrrhus raises his hand, signaling a shift in the tide of battle. From the flanks, the earth trembles beneath the weight of the advancing forces, as the ground seems to shudder in anticipation of what is to come. The mighty elephants, colossal and imposing, storm into combat with a thunderous charge, directed straight at the Roman cavalry. The scent emanating from these enormous beasts is nothing short of pure terror, an overwhelming, primal smell that the Romans have never encountered before.
The chaos of the battlefield becomes a maelstrom of panic and fury as the horses go berserk, throwing off their riders in a frantic bid for survival, shattering the disciplined formations they once obeyed so meticulously. The elephants, with their immense strength, crush men beneath their massive feet as if they were mere insects, insignificant and easily destroyed. Their powerful trunks flail through the air, tossing bodies high above the chaos, turning the battlefield into a grisly spectacle of destruction. The once unyielding discipline of the Roman legions begins to crumble under the weight of this unfamiliar horror. Soldiers, overwhelmed and terror-stricken, abandon their posts and retreat in disarray. The battle, which seemed to be leaning in Pyrrhus's favor, suddenly collapses into chaos. Pyrrhus emerges victorious, yet as he walks across the devastated terrain, a wave of stark reality strikes him hard in the stomach. The haunting silence of reflection is punctuated only by the somber music that seems to echo through the ruins. He has lost his most trusted officers, those leaders whose courage and strategy once held the line. Among the fallen is Megacles, a brave and loyal companion. Furthermore, Pyrrhus mourns the loss of 4,000 veterans, battle-hardened soldiers whose experience and loyalty are irreplaceable, especially since they are hundreds of miles away from their homeland, cut off from any immediate support or reinforcements. The Roman forces, by contrast, have lost around 7,000 men, but these casualties are marked by a different kind of bravery. They fell with their armor pierced, facing the enemy directly, with no retreat, no surrender. Yet, the most harrowing realization does not stem from the immediate loss of life. It emerges in the aftermath of the next day's dawn. The Roman army, despite the heavy toll, has not disintegrated.
The Roman consul, Lucius, humiliated but unbroken, begins the arduous process of rebuilding. He swiftly starts recruiting new troops, forming 2 fresh legions right in Rome, showing resilience and determination that refuse to accept defeat. The city itself, far from demanding peace, prepares vigorously for a second confrontation, a renewed fight to defend its honor and independence. Meanwhile, Pyrrhus, ever the strategist, dispatches Cineas to Rome with a generous offer of peace. He urges the Romans to surrender, to acknowledge his military superiority, and to capitulate before further bloodshed. However, the response from the Roman Senate, delivered through an elderly, blind man named Appius Claudius, is nothing short of a death sentence for Pyrrhus's ambitions. Their reply is a resolute refusal, an unwavering declaration that the city will not accept defeat and that their fight must continue, no matter the cost.
This rejection seals Pyrrhus's fate, setting the stage for a fierce and unrelenting struggle that will determine the future of Rome and its sovereignty. Rome would never engage in negotiations as long as a foreign army remained on Italian soil. There was no room for diplomatic solutions, no option for surrender. Pyrrhus understood this all too well. He was not merely fighting a conventional army, but confronting an entire ideology that refused to yield. Having secured a victory on the battlefield, Pyrrhus realized that the broader conflict was far from over. In fact, the war had become nearly unwinnable, and winter was fast approaching. Undeterred, Pyrrhus pressed forward. His forces advanced with relentless determination, and soon he reached such proximity to Rome that he could see the billowing smoke rising from its chimneys,
darkening the sky above the city. They were now only about 60 kilometers away from the Eternal City, a mere stone's throw in ancient terms.
Pyrrhus harbored a hope that panic and fear would do much of his work for him. He anticipated that the weary Roman allies, exhausted by relentless taxation and ongoing conflicts, might eventually open their gates and welcome him as a liberator, weary of their rulers and eager for change. Yet, these hopes proved unfounded. The city gates remained firmly shut, and no cheers echoed in his ears. The surrounding Latin cities watched his army from their fortified walls, their silence thick with hostility. At that moment, Pyrrhus grasped the immense resilience of the Roman Federation. It was not a fragile empire maintained by fear and oppression, but a powerful alliance held together by loyalty, shared law, and a common sense of identity. Surrounded by hostile territory, with winter biting at his heels, the undefeated king was forced to reconsider his position and ultimately turn back.
He withdrew without having launched a single spear against the formidable walls of Rome. A retreat that was, in itself, a moral defeat of enormous significance. The loss weighed heavily on him, not just in terms of territory, but in morale. The winter months that followed were filled with brutal training sessions and mounting anxiety, as both sides understood that spring would bring a new wave of bloodshed. The coming conflict was inevitable. Fast forward to the year 279 before Christ. The stage is set at Asculum, a city of strategic importance. This time, the Romans were determined not to repeat the mistakes they had made at Heraclea. They had studied their enemy meticulously, learning from past failures, and had gained valuable insights into the strengths and weaknesses of Pyrrhus's formidable forces. They recognized that their traditional phalanx was clumsy and ineffective on difficult terrain, and that their elephants could be easily frightened if approached correctly. The new Roman army was a product of this hard-earned knowledge, ready to face the challenge with renewed strategy and resolve. In the early hours of a dawn shrouded in mist, an army of 40,000 men, commanded by the consuls Publius Mus and Publius Sulpicius, established their encampment amidst a rugged, wooded landscape. Their camp was strategically positioned near the swift-flowing riverbank, chosen deliberately for its natural advantages. This terrain, with its steep banks and tangled underbrush, was in fact a carefully crafted trap designed to neutralize the cavalry's mobility and the effectiveness of long pikes wielded by Pyrrhus's forces. The geography itself was a formidable obstacle, intended to diminish the enemy's advantage in open-field combat.
The first day of battle proved to be a nightmare from a tactical standpoint for the Greek king. As dawn broke, Pyrrhus observed his phalanx attempting to advance along the steep, uneven riverbanks. The soldiers, armed with their imposing 5-meter-long pikes, found themselves ensnared in the dense branches of trees and tangled undergrowth, causing chaos within their ranks. The once pristine formation was shattered. The disciplined, unified line was broken into disarray. Meanwhile, the Roman legions, equipped with their distinctive oval shields and short swords, moved with a fluid, almost fish-like agility within the melee, weaving through the chaos with practiced ease. The Roman soldiers exploited the gaps and weaknesses in the Greek formation, slipping through the fractured lines to target vulnerable spots, striking at the groin and the neck with deadly precision. The combat was fierce and brutal, a desperate, gritty melee that resembled a street fight more than a traditional battlefield engagement. It was a chaotic and dirty struggle, far removed from the elegant strategic chess match Pyrrhus envisioned. As night fell, exhaustion and frustration gripped both sides. The Greeks had not suffered a decisive defeat, but they had gained no ground. Their efforts had been thwarted by the treacherous terrain and determined Roman resistance. Pyrrhus, observing the relentless stalemate, understood that if the battle continued on this same wooded battleground,
his army's cohesion and effectiveness would be utterly compromised. The dense forest was a trap that threatened to consume his forces if fighting persisted. Therefore, at dawn the next day, Pyrrhus made a bold, calculated move, his masterstroke, before the first light pierced the darkness.
He dispatched select detachments to seize the high ground nearby, forcing the Roman legions out of their advantageous positions and into the open plain. This was the turning point he needed. Now, he had the terrain he desired. As the Allied forces clashed once more, the confrontation took on a terrifying intensity. The Macedonian phalanx, with its formidable array of bronze-tipped sarissa spears, lowered their weapons and surged forward like a massive, unstoppable bulldozer of metal. The advancing phalanx bore down upon the Roman lines with relentless force, their formation resembling a crushing wave of bronze and spear points. The Roman shields, once protective barriers, were shattered as they collided with the dense wall of pikes. Armor was pierced, and many soldiers found themselves overwhelmed beneath the onslaught. In a desperate attempt to break the oncoming momentum, the Roman soldiers tried to cut through the pikes with their swords, aiming to create gaps in the formidable wall.
Others, driven by sheer resolve, seized the long spears with their bare hands, attempting to pry them apart or force their way through the spearhead barrier. Every effort was a fierce struggle against the might of the Macedonian phalanx, a brutal and chaotic scene of hand-to-hand combat, where victory was uncertain and death lurked behind every clash. This clash of steel and will defined the brutal nature of the battle, with Pyrrhus's forces fighting desperately to hold their ground against the overwhelming force of the Macedonian phalanx and the relentless Roman assault. The initial Roman assault is swiftly shattered, with their first wave completely annihilated. Yet, the second wave of Roman soldiers refuses to be deterred. It surges forward relentlessly, moving over the fallen bodies of their comrades and pressing onward with unwavering determination.
These fighters seem to lack any instinct for self-preservation, driven solely by their relentless zeal to advance, regardless of the toll. It is at this critical moment that Pyrrhus, observing the chaos, releases his elephants into the fray. However, the Romans have prepared for this terrifying onslaught with ingenuity and daring. They have devised a series of peculiar and formidable contraptions, strange chariots equipped with blazing torches, hooks, and scythes that are launched directly at the monstrous beasts. Roman archers, meanwhile, fire volleys of flaming arrows, their flames flickering ominously in the smoky air. The battlefield fills with the acrid stench of burnt flesh, mingled with the chaos of panicked animals and terrified soldiers. The scene is one of utter devastation, a cacophony of fire, fear, and fighting. For a fleeting moment, it appears that the Roman troops might withstand the ferocious charge. Their defenses seem to hold, and the tide of battle might turn in their favor. Yet the overwhelming strength of the elephants, combined with the swift, light infantry that Pyrrhus has sent forward, eventually breaks the Roman lines. The flanks of the Roman army begin to crumble and fold inward, and the center is forced into a retreat. Despite the chaos, the Roman retreat is not a disorderly rout, but a disciplined withdrawal, maintaining formation and readiness to fight again if necessary. They withdraw to their fortified camp, slowly and with precision, still dangerous until the last moment. Once again, Pyrrhus claims victory. As the sun dips below the horizon, the king surveys the battlefield, which now lies slick with blood, making the ground treacherous underfoot. His messengers approach with reports of the casualties. The toll is significant. 6,000 Roman soldiers lie dead on the field. It is a figure that commands respect, an impressive and costly victory.
Curious about his own losses, Pyrrhus asks for the numbers. The officer hesitates, visibly trembling, before answering. 3,500 fallen, my lord, he reports. Pyrrhus stands in silence, momentarily stunned. The figure seems smaller than the Roman casualties, Yet, in the brutal calculus of warfare, raw numbers rarely tell the full story. The 6,000 Romans who perished were mostly conscripted peasants, recruited just a month prior, easily replaceable in the grand scheme of Rome's war machine. In contrast, the 3,500 dead of Pyrrhus's side were primarily members of his elite fighting force, experienced, seasoned warriors who were far harder to replace. The true cost of victory, then, is measured not just in numbers, but in the quality and value of those who fall. Once his closest friends from childhood, his most trusted captains, the seasoned veterans who had crossed the seas alongside him, these men were truly irreplaceable.
They formed the backbone of his army, the core around which his entire campaign revolved. Their expertise in executing complex maneuvers was unparalleled, and their loyalty was unwavering. Now, however, that vital force was shattered. His high command, once a formidable and cohesive unit, had been wiped from the map. Pyrrho found himself isolated in a foreign land, increasingly vulnerable with each passing victory, which seemed to drain rather than strengthen him. Each triumph, though seemingly a step forward, left him weaker, his army more depleted, and his spirit burdened by the weight of inevitable loss. As he stood amidst the aftermath of yet another brutal clash, a soldier approached, eager to share in the triumph and perhaps earn a reward or a few words of encouragement. Pyrrho cast a vacant stare at the soldier, his eyes hollow and distant, as he pointed toward the corpses of fallen comrades piled high for the funeral pyres.
In that silent moment, he uttered a phrase that would resonate through his subsequent fate. "If we achieve one more victory against the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." The words carried a bitter truth. What seemed like triumph was, in reality, a prelude to disaster. From this point, a new chapter was born, the so-called victory of Pyrrhus, which, paradoxically, marked the beginning of his downfall. Winning that battle, instead of securing his empire's future, set in motion a chain of events that would doom him to lose the larger war. In this moment of profound vulnerability, a letter arrived, breaking the oppressive silence. It was not from Rome, nor from Epirus, but from the south, specifically from the island of Sicily. The message was urgent. The Greek city of Syracuse was beseeched for aid, pleading for help to repel the advancing Carthaginians.
They offered him the throne of Sicily and the chance to expel the Carthaginian invaders. A tempting escape, a noble pretext to abandon the relentless nightmare of endless Roman legions. Pyrrho's gaze shifted first to the north, where the resilient city of Rome stubbornly refused to succumb, standing as a formidable foe that seemed impossible to defeat. Then, his eyes drifted southward, toward a new horizon, toward a fresh adventure, a renewed hope, and perhaps a perilous mistake. The decision was made. He would leave Italy behind. He chose to abandon his Tarentine allies to their own fate, forsaking the land that had been both his battleground and his prison. Murmuring to himself, "What battlefield do we leave for the Romans and the Carthaginians?" He watched as his ships set sail, leaving behind the chaos of his campaign. In his mind, he believed he was heading toward glory in Sicily, an opportunity to carve out a new empire, to forge a legacy beyond the ruins of Italy. Yet, in the depths of his soul, a quiet voice questioned whether this pursuit of victory would ultimately lead him to ruin. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty, and the choices he made now would determine whether he would be remembered as a hero or as a tragic figure lost to his own hubris. Unaware of the trap into which he was unwittingly walking, he sailed straight into a political snare that would paint the Romans in a far more benign light compared to the treacherous game he was about to engage in. Sicily, at that moment, greeted him as if he were a living deity, its cities opening their gates in awe and reverence. Wreaths of flowers decorated every street,
their vibrant colors creating a festive atmosphere, while local men threw themselves at his feet in a mixture of admiration and hope.
To the inhabitants, he was not merely a foreign general. He was the heir of Alexander the Great himself, the only man capable of freeing their island from the oppressive yoke of Carthage. Initially, Pyrrhus proved to be a force of terrifying effectiveness. His campaign on Sicily unfolded like a masterclass in swift, decisive warfare, what historians might call a lightning campaign. Within merely a few weeks, he managed to sweep away the Carthaginian armies that had seemed unstoppable. He captured the seemingly impregnable city of Eryx, leading the assault himself. Climbing the city walls amidst a hail of arrows, he fought with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural, slaying anyone who dared stand in his way with a brutal intensity. No opposition could seem to halt him. He pushed the Carthaginian Empire's greatest trading hub to the very edge of the sea. The terrified Carthaginians, recognizing their defeat, quickly sought peace. They offered ships, gold, and even proposed to relinquish control over the entire island, except for one strategic stronghold. Lilybeo, their last fortress, was the only remnant of resistance. With this, Pyrrhus seemed poised for total victory. The time had come to sign treaties, consolidate gains, and establish his rule over Sicily. Yet, Pyrrhus's insatiable ambition soon revealed its darker side. Instead of accepting the peace offers, he dismissed them with a reckless declaration of all or nothing. His desire to invade Africa grew stronger. He wanted to emulate the legendary exploits of Agathocles and become the master of the Mediterranean Sea. To undertake such an invasion, however, he needed an enormous fleet, one that would allow him to cross the treacherous waters and establish a foothold across the continent's southern coast. This is precisely where the true nature of the conqueror was unveiled. Beneath his veneer of heroism, Pyrrhus revealed himself as a ruthless tyrant. He began to demand resources that went far beyond strategic needs. He demanded gold, vast quantities of timber, and, most insidiously, he sought to enlist the young Greek men of Sicily, those who had initially invited him to fight for their freedom, now to become tools of his expanding ambitions. The man who had once seemed a liberator was transforming into a dictator hungry for conquest, willing to strip Sicily of its resources and its youth to fuel his relentless pursuit of empire. Relying on his troops to fight and die for him, Pyrrhus faced a growing sense of doubt among the Sicilians. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. In response, Pyrrhus adopted a ruthless stance. He ordered executions, detained the leaders of the democratic factions, stationed military garrisons in the allied cities, and governed with an iron fist. His relentless tactics over the course of less than 2 years achieved what many would have thought impossible. He succeeded in turning the Greek population against him to such an extent that they began to despise their once heroic savior more than they hated their enemies. The intensity of this animosity was so profound that some Sicilian cities started secretly dispatching messengers to the Carthaginians, preferring the bleak prospects of commercial slavery under Carthage to the oppressive military tyranny of Pyrrhus. Slowly, the dream of a unified and independent Sicily was crumbling before his eyes. Meanwhile, Pyrrhus found himself embroiled in internal rebellions, further destabilizing his grip on the island. Just as chaos threatened to engulf him, a desperate cry arose from across the sea. Tarentum, once again. The city was calling for help. The Roman Republic had exploited Pyrrhus's absence, launching a brutal campaign against the southern regions of Italy with meticulous cruelty. The combined forces of the Amnites and the Tarentines were pushed to the brink of annihilation. Their pleas for aid reached Pyrrhus, imploring him to return, with the stark warning, "Come back, or we will all perish." This was the perfect pretext for him to leave. Pyrrhus understood that Sicily was lost.
not because of military defeat alone, but because of political disillusionment and the erosion of support. Fearing that his own subjects might turn their blades against him, he resolved to escape before they could strike him down. Gathering the remnants of his army, he set sail back to Italy, but the return voyage proved to be a nightmare. The Carthaginians were waiting for him. In the narrow waters of the Strait of Messina, their fleet ambushed Pyrrhus's transports in a devastating naval trap. The ensuing battle was catastrophic, a massacre at sea. 70 Carthaginian warships sank Pyrrhus's fleet, sealing his fate.
From the deck of his battered ships, Pyrrhus watched as his seasoned veterans, the treasure of Sicilian gold, and his dreams of conquest were swallowed by the dark, unforgiving waters of the Mediterranean. The victory for the Carthaginians was complete, and Pyrrhus's ambitions on the island, once so close to realization, were forever drowned in the tumultuous waves of history. Arriving along the Italian coast, Pyrrho's army was a shadow of its former might, crushed, demoralized, and utterly penniless. It had been 3 long years since his departure, a period marked by lost opportunities and squandered hopes. Now, he found himself back at the starting point, but fundamentally weakened, both in strength and spirit. To make matters worse, the landscape of power had shifted dramatically. Rome had evolved, and the old fears that once held their enemies at bay had faded. The Romans no longer trembled at the sight of elephants.
They had learned how to kill them, how to outflank the formidable phalanx, and most significantly, they no longer regarded Pyrrhus with the dread he once commanded. The myth of his invincibility was shattered. It was now the year 275 before Christ, and Pyrrhus was marching toward Benevento, preparing for what he knew would be a decisive and final confrontation. His situation was desperate. Time was running out, and he needed a swift victory to plunder the Roman camp and pay his hungry mercenaries, who had been loyal for too long without reward. His plan was bold. A surprise night assault through dense forests, aiming to ambush the Romans at dawn. Such a maneuver was fraught with risk, either genius or madness, and the outcome hung in the balance. Luck, that fickle ally who had followed Pyrrhus through countless battles, finally turned its back on him. As the night fell, the torches went out. Guides lost their way in the darkness of the woods, and chaos ensued. Men stumbled, formations disintegrated, and precious time slipped away unnoticed. When dawn finally broke, the once promising attack was no longer viable. Pyrrhus's forces were exhausted, scattered, and clumsily descending the mountainside, completely exposed to Roman sentinels watching from their camp. In Rome, the news reached the camp of Consul Manius Curius Dentatus as he awoke. Instead of feeling fear, he recognized opportunity. A calculated sense of resolve took hold. Without hesitation, he ordered his legions to form up immediately. This time, they would not wait for the enemy to strike first. Rome would strike preemptively. The dawn's light cast an ominous glow over Benevento, not revealing a prepared Roman assault, but instead exposing a scene of chaos and failure unfolding in slow motion. What greeted the Romans was not a disciplined attack, but a tableau of disarray, a disastrous sight that foretold the end of Pyrrhus's hopes for victory.
After a long, exhausting night spent wandering through dense forests and treacherous ravines, the soldiers of Pyrrhus, their eyes sunken and their bodies parched from thirst, descended from the hills like ghostly apparitions, wavering, unsteady, yet driven by a relentless purpose. Their appearance betrayed their fatigue, and the element of surprise that once may have favored them had long since dissipated. Now, they found themselves exposed, vulnerable targets laid bare under the open sky, their once hopeful momentum turned into a fragile, desperate stance. Seizing this moment of evident weakness,
The Roman consul Manius Curio Dentatus, a man keenly alert to the shifting tide of battle, recognized the opportunity with unwavering confidence. Without hesitation, he ordered his legionaries to advance swiftly up the hill, knowing that delaying could allow the enemy to regroup or rally. The clash that ensued was fierce and chaotic, a brutal melee where discipline blurred into chaos.
The Roman soldiers, fresh from rest and reinvigorated by their preparation, struck with renewed ferocity, their shields gleaming as they pressed forward. The front lines of Pyrrhus's forces buckled under the relentless pressure of the Roman onslaught, their shields shattering beneath the weight of the legion's determined assault. There was no elegance or refined strategy in this brutal confrontation, only raw, instinctive desperation. The Epirotes fought desperately for their survival, retreating step by agonizing step. Despite the dire circumstances, Pyrrhus still held a trump card, a strategic reserve that he hoped would turn the tide once more. On the opposite flank, over a stretch of flatter terrain, Pyrrhus managed to deploy his formidable elephants. These towering behemoths, symbols of his might, charged forward. And for a fleeting moment, the battlefield was filled with panic and terror as the animals rampaged through the chaos.
The Roman ranks hesitated, their confidence shaken as the line of battle started to waver and break. It appeared that history was poised to repeat itself, another hard-fought victory snatched from the jaws of potential defeat, a Pyrrhic triumph that threatened to leave the Romans battered and bloodied. Yet, the Romans had learned the bitter lessons of previous encounters, especially from their experience at Asculum. This time, they refused to retreat or flee in disarray. In a decisive move, Consul Curio issued orders to his reserves. Instead of charging with swords drawn, they were to hurl javelins, thousands of these slender, deadly projectiles toward the advancing elephants. The javelins flew through the air in a relentless barrage, not with the intent to kill outright, but to sow chaos and madness.
The soldiers targeted the elephants' sensitive eyes, their trunks, and the delicate skin behind their ears, vulnerable spots that could turn these mighty beasts into frightened, uncontrollable monsters. One young elephant, wounded and trembling with fear, let out a deafening cry, calling out for its mother. The maternal instinct surged in the thick of the chaos. The elephant's mother, amid the tumult of battle, heard her offspring's desperate call and, overwhelmed by maternal fury and panic, went berserk. Her mind, torn between instinct and horror, was driven to madness as she charged blindly through the fray, a tragic symbol of the chaos and unpredictability of war. Breaking through the ranks to reach him, the chaos erupts with unrestrained fury. The entire battlefield descends into a maelstrom of disorder, where the elephants, once formidable allies, now behave as wild beasts, no longer able to distinguish friend from foe.
They turn abruptly, their massive bodies thrashing and trampling everything in their path.
Then, in the midst of this turmoil, the final catastrophe unfolds in a harrowing spectacle. The army of Pyrrhus, once a mighty force, begins to tear itself apart. His war elephants, driven by panic and confusion, suddenly charge against their own infantry, creating a scene reminiscent of a nightmare. The Greek soldiers, overwhelmed and caught in the chaos, are crushed beneath the relentless weight of these enormous beasts. their ranks shattered as the monstrous creatures break through their lines under the crushing force of tons of gray flesh and tusks. The disciplined formation, which moments before had stood as a testament to military strength, disintegrates in a deafening combination of shouts, screams, and swirling dust. The Roman forces, observing the carnage from a safe distance, cannot contain their excitement. They erupt into victorious cheers, their spirits emboldened by the sight of their enemies in disarray. Without hesitation, they press forward, seizing the moment to finish off the remaining survivors of Pyrrhus's battered army. Meanwhile, Pyrrhus himself watches the unfolding disaster from the rear of his forces, a silent spectator to the self-destruction of his once glorious army. His mind is heavy with the realization that no clever maneuver, no strategic genius can now halt this chaos. The situation is beyond salvation. For the first time in Italy's history, Pyrrhus issues the order to retreat entirely. This is not a strategic withdrawal aimed at regrouping or reassessing. It is a desperate flight from the battlefield, a retreat driven by the stark necessity of survival. He turns back toward Tarentum, leaving behind the fruits of his grand ambitions. Of the 25,000 men he initially brought with him, fewer than 8,000 remain standing.
His resources are depleted. He has no money left, and his alliances have evaporated. Rome, ever the dominant force, controls the battlefield entirely, leaving a small garrison in Tarentum with promises to return with reinforcements that seem increasingly unlikely to materialize. This retreat marks Pyrrhus's final deception to the Italian peoples. Deep down, everyone knows that he will not come back. His departure is final. 6 years after his arrival in Italy, Pyrrhus set sail towards Epirus, leaving behind the land he once sought to conquer. His departure is as unceremonious as his arrival. Just as he came, he departs, like a king without a crown, a general without an army, a brilliant mind that has yet to secure a single, lasting victory. Yet, the restless intellect of Pyrrhus refuses to find solace or reflection in defeat. Instead of dwelling on his wounds, he pushes forward, driven by an insatiable need for conquest.
The void created by his losses must be filled immediately with new battles, new ambitions. If he cannot dominate the Western world, then his gaze shifts eastward, toward Greece itself. As soon as his feet touch Greek soil, he begins a new campaign, invading Macedonia, determined to carve out a new realm of power amid the shifting political landscape of the Hellenic world. It is nothing short of madness. The soldiers, exhausted and battered, have little strength left, and their treasuries are all but empty. Yet the reputation of their leader still spreads fear across the land. King Antigone of Macedonia witnesses a startling phenomenon. His own army begins to desert en masse, defecting to the cause of Pyrrhus. The soldiers, whispering among themselves, compare Pyrrhus to an eagle soaring high above the battlefield, while they see themselves as his loyal wings, ready to carry out his commands. Within a few months, Pyrrhus has managed to conquer Macedonia itself. He takes the throne, once occupied by Alexander the Great, and with that, he has achieved his ultimate ambition. Now, he commands a vast realm, wielding both power and glory. He pauses for a moment, consolidates his rule, and begins to govern and build his empire anew. Yet, this moment of apparent stability is fleeting. Barely a year passes before a new messenger arrives, bringing with him a fresh, poisonous proposal. This messenger is a renegade Spartan named Cleonymus, who pleads for Pyrrhus's assistance in claiming the Spartan throne. Any wise ruler, aware of the risks involved, might have refused such a dubious alliance. Macedonia, after all, is fragile, and its armies are weary from constant warfare. Rest and peace are desperately needed.
But Pyrrhus, a man addicted to the thrill of conflict, is not inclined to listen to caution. When he hears the name Sparta, his eyes light up with a fierce, almost obsessive desire.
Sparta, the legendary city of warriors, the epitome of martial strength and discipline. Defeating it would be the crowning achievement of his military career. To humiliate Sparta, to bring it under his sway, would be the ultimate jewel in his crown of conquests. Without hesitation, Pyrrhus assembles his army and marches southward towards the Peloponnese. His force consists of 25,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and 24 elephants, an impressive and formidable contingent, advancing steadily toward the southern coast. As the sun begins to set, Pyrrhus's forces arrive before the gates of Sparta. The city itself, though famed for its martial prowess, is surprisingly weak defensively. Its walls are not particularly strong, relying instead on the legendary valor of its inhabitants. However, most of Sparta's soldiers are out in the fields, engaged in agricultural work, leaving the city vulnerable.
Its generals advise Pyrrhus to attack immediately, suggesting, "Let's strike now, my lord. We can dine in the Spartan agora tonight." Pyrrhus hesitates, torn between the urge to act swiftly and the temptation to delay. He considers the possibility of launching a nocturnal raid, sacking the city in the darkness, unleashing chaos and destruction. For once, he contemplates mercy, perhaps arrogance, hoping that the city will surrender at dawn, seeing the might of his army and recognizing the futility of resistance. He believes that, come morning, Sparta will fall without a fight, overwhelmed by his forces and their relentless power. Begin by organizing the camp. Tomorrow, we will launch our attack. This simple decision, ordering the troops to settle in, becomes the pivotal mistake that ultimately defines his entire life. Underestimating the resilience and unyielding will of the human spirit. That night in Sparta, not a single soul sleeps peacefully.
Women, the elderly, and children emerge from their homes, taking to the streets to prepare a formidable defensive line. They dig a massive trench directly in front of where Pyrrhus' forces are encamped, transforming the terrain into a barrier of mud and earth. They sink carts deep into the muddy ground, aiming to obstruct the charging elephants and hinder the advancing enemy. The women of Sparta, with their hair loose and their tunics tied up for labor, turn to the men and declare with quiet determination, "You may sleep, but we will stay awake and build the defenses." They understand that their survival depends on collective effort and that their resolve must be unwavering. They know that tomorrow, many of them will face death in battle, but tonight, their work must be relentless. As dawn approaches, Pyrrhus' forces find no signs of a city surrendering easily. Instead, they encounter a hastily constructed fortress, fiercely defended by a populace willing to face collective suicide rather than capitulate. Frustrated but undeterred, Pyrrhus orders his army to attack the trench. The assault is fierce. Even his own son, Ptolemy, leads a heroic charge that nearly breaks the enemy's line. For a moment, it seems victory might be within reach, but the defenders rally and repulse the attack, pushing the invaders back. The fighting endures for 2 brutal days. The combat is relentless, savage, and seemingly hopeless. The elephants, heavy and cumbersome, cannot navigate the muddy terrain, while the soldiers perish in the quagmire, trapped and vulnerable. Despite their courage, Pyrrhus' army suffers significant losses, and the strategic situation becomes increasingly dire. Recognizing the fruitlessness of the assault, Pyrrhus withdraws from Sparta, retreating with a heavy heart. What appears to be a moral victory, defending the city at all costs, masks an underlying strategic defeat, as the campaign leaves his forces exhausted and demoralized. As they retreat, tragedy strikes in its most devastating form. During a rearguard skirmish,
Piero's son, Ptolemy, who is destined to be the future leader of their dynasty, falls fighting bravely to cover his father's escape. His sacrifice is poignant and heartbreaking, a testament to his courage and unwavering loyalty. Piero collects his son's body, and in a moment devoid of tears, he gazes upon the fallen prince. With a chilling detachment, he remarks, "It does not surprise me that you died. What surprises me is that you survived as long as you did, being my son." The pain of loss is overshadowed by a brutal acknowledgement of the harshness of fate.
The grief and suffering, however, do not end there. The call for Ptolemy's death echoes from the city of Argos, where the shadows of war deepen the tragedy, and the cycle of violence continues unbroken. Argos is not merely a city, it is an open grave, a vast tomb awaiting its next occupant, and Pyrrhus marches toward it, blinded by overwhelming grief and seething rage. The death of his son Ptolemy has shattered something fundamental within him, something that no longer allows for strategic calculations, nor the pursuit of glory or empire. His struggle now is driven solely by an unbearable silence, a deafening void that the peaceful quiet of the city cannot fill. He requires the clamor of steel and the clash of weapons to drown out the relentless screams echoing inside his mind. Within Argos, two factions vie desperately for dominance. One, led by a man named Aristeus, secretly invites Pyrrhus to seize power, whispering promises of clandestine support and offering a chance to dominate the city from within. Meanwhile, the other faction, gripped by fear and desperation, calls upon Pyrrhus's arch-enemy, Antigonus Gonatas, the king of Macedonia whom Pyrrhus recently humiliated, to intervene and crush the uprising. It is a race toward catastrophe, a deadly contest involving two kings, two armies, and a city caught precariously in the middle. Pyrrhus arrives ahead of his enemies, encamping outside the city's walls, confident in his position, but haunted by ominous signs. The portents of doom grow louder when a priest, performing an ancient ritual by sacrificing a sacred ox to the gods, examines the animal's entrails, a practice revered in the ancient world for divining future events.
As he inspects the viscera, the priest's face pales. The liver, an organ believed to hold divine messages, reveals a dire omen. It is without lobes, an unmistakable sign of imminent death for a member of the royal family. Pyrrhus, hearing of this, responds with bitter laughter, an echo of despair. He has already lost his son. What more could the gods take from him? Yet he dismisses the divine warning as mere superstition, focusing instead on the fact that the gates of Diampres will open that very night. It is, without doubt, the darkest hour before dawn, when betrayal is at its peak and the shadows of treachery are cast across the city. That night, as darkness cloaks Argos, treachery is consummated. Aristeus, the secretive leader of one faction, opens the city gates. The vanguard of Pyrrhus's Gallic mercenaries slips silently into the sleeping city, their steps light and precise. Their plan is straightforward but deadly. Seize control of the agora, the central marketplace, and secure the high ground. Their goal is clear: to dawn as the rightful rulers of Argos, establishing dominance over the city before anyone can react. The stage is set for a brutal and decisive confrontation, with the city's fate hanging in the balance as the first light of dawn approaches. War, by its very nature, becomes a relentless arena of friction and unpredictable clashes, where even carefully laid plans can be shattered by the most absurd, almost comical obstacles, if such setbacks weren't ultimately deadly. In this particular scenario, the obstacle in question is none other than the massive, formidable elephants. The gates of Argos, ancient and low, were not designed to accommodate such colossal creatures. These war elephants, towering giants bearing enormous wooden towers strapped onto their backs,
bristled with archers ready to unleash chaos on the enemy lines.
Yet, their size posed a significant problem. They simply did not fit through the narrow, low entrance. As the night descended into an eerie silence, broken only by the muffled sounds of effort and tension, the soldiers faced an urgent, delicate task. They had to prevent the enemy's infiltration by halting the elephant's advance. To do so, they needed to act swiftly. They first had to loosen the straps, securing the heavy wooden towers to the elephant's backs, then carefully lower these cumbersome wooden structures onto the ground. Once the towers were free, the soldiers had to coax the massive beasts to kneel and crawl under the narrow stone archway, an almost impossible feat for such enormous animals. Only after the elephants had successfully passed could the soldiers reattach the towers, hoist them back onto the animals' backs, and secure them tightly once again. The entire operation was fraught with noise and tension.
The creaking of the wooden towers as they shifted, the clattering of metal against stone, and the frantic curses shouted by the elephant drivers shattered the profound silence of the night. Every moment spent wrestling with these colossal creatures was a moment stolen from the element of surprise, a gap that the defenders desperately needed to prevent their city's fall. Meanwhile, the city of Argos stirred from its slumber. The inhabitants, attuned to the strange, unsettling noises echoing through the darkness, peered anxiously out of their windows. Against the star-studded sky, they could make out the grotesque silhouettes of the elephants, monstrous shapes outlined by the faint glow of distant stars, heightening their fears. The alarm spread rapidly, a frantic cry echoing through the streets. The enemy was already inside the city walls. Pyrrho had managed to breach their defenses. Panic erupted among the Argives. Citizens rushed to the citadel, shouting for aid and desperately seeking help. Their voices carried into the night, carrying the urgent message far and wide. Messengers were dispatched immediately to the camp of Antigone, stationed on the far side of the city, with orders to send reinforcements as swiftly as possible. However, Antigone was no fool. He recognized the peril and the cunning of his adversary. Rather than rushing headlong into the chaos, he chose a more strategic approach. He sent his son, along with his most elite troops, to seal off all the city's exits, effectively trapping the enemy within the walls. Simultaneously, from the south, the Spartan king Ario, who had been pursuing Pyrrho in a quest for revenge, arrived with a force of 1,000 Cretan soldiers. His arrival added a new, formidable element to the unfolding battle, further complicating Pyrrho's plans and shifting the momentum in favor of the defenders. Pyrrho was no longer the hunter. He had become the hunted.
His forces, once formidable, now found themselves engulfed in a relentless tide of chaos. He entered the narrow, winding streets of Argos with the bulk of his army, expecting the familiar open plains of Italy where his tactics thrived. But Argos was no open battlefield. It was a labyrinth of tight alleyways, shadowy passageways, and intricate drainage canals designed by nature and man alike to confound and trap. Darkness cloaked every corner, transforming the city into a nightmarish maze where confusion reigned supreme and clarity was a distant memory. As the Macedonian phalanx advanced, their formation, meticulously crafted for open, organized combat, began to crumble under the oppressive constraints of the streets. The 5-meter-long pikes, which had been their most formidable weapon in open battle, proved utterly useless here. Instead of presenting a formidable wall, they merely collided with walls, became entangled in hanging laundry lines, and hindered swift movement or turns. The soldiers, unable to distinguish friend from foe amid the chaos, fought desperately by the sound of shouting voices, their cries blending into an indistinguishable cacophony. Meanwhile, Pyrrho's Gallic warriors, driven by the frenzy of the melee, turned on each other, their blades flashing as they fought in confusion and rage. The elephants, stressed and terrified by the confined space and the deafening noise,
began to trample indiscriminately, crushing everything in their path with reckless fury. Piero, mounted and frantic, rode back and forth through the chaos, barking orders he knew no one could hear. His voice was lost amidst the tumult, yet he pressed on, desperately trying to impose some semblance of command amid the madness. This was war in its most primitive and terrifying form. Lines had dissolved, strategies vanished, leaving only men stabbing at each other in the dark, slipping in the mud of drainage ditches, their shouts drowned out by the din of the battle.
The city itself seemed to conspire against him, dark alleys amplifying the confusion, shadows hiding enemies at every turn. Gradually, the first light of dawn began to seep into the city, piercing the gloom and revealing the full horror of the trap. As the sun's rays illuminated the battered streets, Piero reached the walls of Lagora and lifted his gaze. The citadel, a strategic stronghold crucial to his campaign, was heavily fortified with enemy shields, a clear sign of his enemy's resolve and preparation. From above, he saw Cretans, Spartans, and Antigonus's Macedonians, all watching him intently, their eyes fixed on his movements. The city was encased in a ring of foes, and in the heart of this chaos, his eyes settled on a weathered bronze statue in the market square. The sculpture was ancient, its surface worn smooth by centuries of weather and time. It depicted a fierce scene, a wolf engaged in a primal struggle against a bull, symbolic of strength and ferocity.
As Piero gazed upon it, a shiver ran down his spine. Blood drained from his face. In that moment, a sudden, sharp memory struck him. A prophecy from the oracle he had sought years earlier. It was a stark reminder of the dark fate that seemed to loom over him, echoing ominously as the dawn's light cast long shadows over the battered city. One of those cryptic phrases that heroes often forget until it's far too late. An ominous warning that lingers in the back of their minds, foretelling a tragic fate. It's said that the moment you see a wolf engaged in combat with a bull, that will be the day you meet your end. In this scenario, fate has indeed sealed its cruel decree, completing a deadly circle that cannot be broken. Pyrrhus, the commander, is painfully aware that the battle has been lost beyond any hope of victory. The labyrinth of stone walls and battlements that once seemed impregnable now offers no chance for triumph.
His only remaining course of action is to save the remnants of his battered army, to retreat before the enemy swarms over them. Recognizing the urgency, he makes the decision to withdraw. But he knows that escape hinges on the condition of a crucial point. The gate of Diampers must be clear and unobstructed. With a sense of grim resolve, Pyrrhus summons a messenger, handing him a precise and urgent command intended for his son Eleno, who is stationed outside the city walls with the reserve forces. The order is clear: demolish part of the wall so that they can make a swift exit. Pyrrhus emphasizes that under no circumstances should anyone attempt to enter through the main gate. Instead, they must break through it directly. The messenger, burdened with the weight of such a critical task, spurs his horse into a frantic gallop, darting through the chaos of the ongoing battle.
The noise around him is deafening. Clashing steel, roaring voices, the scream of wounded men and trumpeting elephants, filling him with terror and disorientation. By the time he reaches Eleno, the message has been tragically distorted. Instead of instructing him to create a breach for the retreat, the message now falsely claims that Pyrrhus is trapped and desperately needs help. It urges Eleno to enter the city and attack with all his might. Driven by the desperate hope of saving his father, Eleno orders the reserve troops and the remaining elephants to charge toward the gate of Dion Perez, hoping to rescue Pyrrhus, or at least create a diversion. However, This act of desperation becomes the final mistake. Inside the city, Pyrrhus struggles to emerge from the chaos, trying to find a way out amid the collapsing structures and falling debris. Outside, Eleno pushes forward with all his force, attempting to breach the gate and reach his father.
As these two forces converge, one within the city walls and the other outside, a brutal collision ensues. Two massive flows of men and beasts collide headlong at the narrow archway, creating a deadly bottleneck. No one can advance, no one can retreat. It is a crushing jam of flesh, steel, and fury, with every effort thwarted by the unyielding crush of bodies. In the midst of this chaos, the largest of Pyrrhus's elephants, grievously wounded, collapses right beneath the arch, its enormous corpse blocking the only escape route. The scene is a tragic tableau of destruction, where even the mightiest are brought low by miscommunication and the relentless tide of battle. Another mighty elephant, named Nikon, roars desperately in search of its fallen rider. With ferocious strength, it charges wildly into the chaos, smashing into friends and foes alike, tossing bodies high into the air and blocking any hope of escape with relentless force. The scene is one of utter pandemonium, where the ground trembles beneath the thundering footsteps of the rampaging beast, and the air is thick with dust, screams, and the clash of metal. Nikon's frantic assault leaves no room for hesitation. It is driven by instinct and desperation, determined to find its master or wreak havoc in its rage. Meanwhile, Pyrrho finds himself ensnared within a perilous trap, a rat's nest of danger from which there seems to be no easy escape. To avoid recognition amid the chaos, he strips off the royal diadem that adorns his helmet, a small act that symbolizes his desire to blend into the chaos and hide his identity. With a quick, decisive motion, he turns his horse sharply, knowing deep down that his only option is to forge a path through the melee, an inevitable, deadly dance with death.
The situation at the gates of Diampras is nothing short of catastrophic. The exit is completely blocked by a towering pile of fallen, lifeless bodies, a gruesome barricade that seems insurmountable. The fallen elephant lies sprawled across the entrance, its massive form acting as a seemingly impassable barrier, an almost insurmountable wall of flesh and bone, stopping all hope of retreat. Pyrrho, a man who has crossed the treacherous waters of the Adriatic, challenged the might of Rome, and once led armies to conquer Macedonia, now faces an undeniable truth. There is no way out. Trapped in what appears to be an impossible dead end, he makes a split-second decision. Instead of surrendering to despair or being crushed beneath the carcass of the fallen elephant, he spins his horse around with determination and charges back into the heart of the city's chaos.
If fate is to claim him, he vows that it will be in combat, fighting to the very end, refusing to die a passive victim beneath the weight of death. Pyrrho is wounded. There's a fresh, painful wound where a spear has pierced his armor, piercing his side and leaving a dark stain on his tunic. Blood seeps from the wound, staining the fabric. Yet adrenaline surges through his veins, keeping him upright and alert despite the injury. His eyes scan the battlefield, searching for enemies, any sign of opposition. His mind no longer processes tactics or strategy. All he perceives are enemies, indistinguishable in his fury, as faceless targets to be struck down. In the midst of this chaos, a lone Argive soldier, an ordinary man with no fame or written record, dares to challenge him. The soldier hurls a javelin with trembling courage, narrowly missing its mark.
Pyrrho, filled with a primal roar of rage,
spurs his horse into a furious charge, intending to crush the soldier beneath his hooves, to end his challenge in a single blow. This is the classic confrontation: king of warriors versus a mere foot soldier. A brutal clash of might and will. In any other day, under different circumstances, the Argive's head would have been severed from his body in a heartbeat, his life ending in a gruesome, swift display of power. But this is no ordinary battle. It's a street fight, a savage melee where rules are broken and chaos reigns supreme. Here, survival hinges not on tactics, but on raw instinct and relentless resolve, where the outcome hangs by a thread in the tumultuous storm of combat. In the narrow streets of Argos, death does not always come rushing directly from the front. Often, it descends unexpectedly from above. On the flat rooftops of the houses that line the alleyway, the women of Argos stand silently, watching the brutal chaos unfold beneath them with a mixture of fear and fierce resolve. These women, mothers, wives, grandmothers, do not wield swords or shields, yet they harbor a fierce, unwavering fury that fuels their instinct to protect what is theirs at all costs. Their silent vigil is a testament to their strength, a quiet yet powerful stand against the violence that rages around them. One elderly woman, her face etched with lines of age and worry, leans precariously over the edge of her rooftop. Below, amidst the swirling dust clouds and the shouts of combat, she spots her son, her child, caught in the midst of the fray. He is a soldier, bravely confronting Pyrrhus, the formidable king of Epirus. She watches as the regal horseman, cloaked in a flowing cape, raises his sword, preparing to deliver what could be a fatal blow to her young son. The image is striking. The magnificent rider, with his armor gleaming, poised to strike down a boy who is fighting with everything he has. For her, time seems to stand still. In that moment, all thought ceases, replaced by an immediate, primal urge to protect. Her old, rough hands clutch the only weapon within reach, a broken tile, a fragment of worn ceramic, darkened and stained with soot and moss. Without hesitation, she lifts it with both trembling hands, leans over the edge into the void, and releases her grip. It is not the precision of a marksman or the strength of a seasoned warrior that guides her, but the raw, instinctual cry of a mother fighting to save her child. The tile spins through the air, a simple piece of debris turned weapon by desperation. It strikes Pyrrhus squarely at the base of his neck, precisely where his helmet fails to shield the vulnerable vertebrae beneath. The sound that follows is harsh and unmistakable. A sickening crack of bone breaking, a jarring, visceral snap of life slipping away. For the mighty king of Epirus, the moment is instant and irreversible. His light extinguishes, leaving behind no last words, no heroic farewell. There is no grand speech, no dramatic declaration. The mother's desperate act breaks his spine, paralyzing him instantly. The sword he held in his grasp slips from his fingers, falling to the dirt-stained stones below. Pyrrhus's body slumps from his horse like a heavy sack of grain tumbling into the filthy alley of Argos, a stark reminder that even the most formidable warriors can be brought down by the simplest, most primal acts of courage, driven by fear, love, and an unyielding will to defend. He is still alive, yet utterly immobilized, unable to move a muscle. Lying on his back, he gazes upward at the sky, which is beginning to lighten with the dawn, while confusion clouds his mind. leaving him unable to comprehend what has just transpired. His vision blurs, and the distant hum of battle gradually turns into a faint, muffled drone. Nearby, a mercenary soldier, serving under Antigone, named Sopiro, observes him collapse to the ground. Stepping forward with cautious deliberation, as one might approach a wounded lion, Sopiro recognizes the fallen man. It is Pyrrho, legendary, monstrous, the stuff of myth. With trembling hands, Sopiro draws a short sword, a gladius, and moves closer. His grip is unsteady, his hands trembling violently, not from the fatigue of combat, but from an overwhelming fear that borders on reverence. For a moment, he stands on the brink of killing a living legend. Pyrrho, despite being paralyzed and conscious, slowly opens his eyes.
The stare he directs at Sopiro is terrifying. An expression that had once struck fear into seasoned veterans. An intense, piercing gaze that seems to hold the power to freeze a man in place. Even broken and sprawled on the ground, Pyrrho's presence commands awe and dread. So profound is Sopiro's terror that he cannot manage a clean strike. He recoils, averting his gaze from the formidable figure before him, and strikes blindly. His first slash misses the throat entirely, instead grazing the mouth and chin, and blood begins to spurt uncontrollably. Panic overtakes him. With desperate, frantic effort, he strikes again, clenching his jaw, fighting to regain control, his hands now stained with the hot, crimson blood of the legendary warrior. After a brutal, frantic struggle, he finally severs Pyrrho's head from his body, the gruesome act completing the tragic end. The eagle, the symbol of Alexander's legacy, has fallen. The heir of Alexander, the terror of Rome, has met his end in a roadside ditch, murdered by a piece of roofing tile and decapitated by a trembling mercenary. So Pyrrho, clutching the blood-soaked head by its hair, runs to find his commander. He locates Alioneo, the son of King Antigone. The young man's reaction is one of pure euphoria, a visceral surge of youthful triumph and excitement. Imagine the severed head of Pyrrhus held aloft as if it were a trophy, a grim symbol of victory. The figure mounts his horse with a triumphant stride, galloping swiftly toward the outside of the city, where his father, Antigonus Gonatus, waits anxiously. As he approaches, Alioneo arrives, shouting loudly in celebration, his voice echoing with triumph. In a moment of grotesque display, he hurls the severed head of Pyrrhus at his father's feet, laughing with a mixture of pride and anticipation, eager for praise and recognition. Yet, Antigonus's gaze remains fixed on the fallen enemy, and his eyes linger on the lifeless, glazed stare of Pyrrhus's eyes, the cruelly severed mouth, and the hair that once bore a resemblance to Alexander's, now lifeless and unrecognizable. Antigonus, burdened with grief and rage, takes his staff and strikes his son with force, a brutal act born of fury and sorrow. "Barbaric!" he screams, tears welling in his eyes, the pain of loss spilling over. "May you be cursed! Do you mock this? Do you mock the fragility of human fortune?" In a moment of solemn reverence, he removes his own royal purple cloak, an emblem of power, and, with a tone of deep respect, carefully covers Pyrrhus's head, as if shielding the fallen warrior from further dishonor. The sound of tears breaking free fills the air, a raw and visceral display of mourning. This grief, however, extends beyond the mere death of Pyrrhus. Antigonus mourns the loss of his own heritage, recalling the figure of his grandfather, the one-eyed Antigonus, who had fallen in battle. His thoughts drift to his father, Demetrius, who had died in captivity. In the severed head of Pyrrhus, he sees a possible reflection of his own future, an ominous omen of mortality and the fleeting nature of power. With a commanding voice, Antigonus orders his men to recover Pyrrhus's body, to cleanse it, dress it in regal garments, and prepare a funeral worthy of a king, emphasizing the respect owed even in death. In the streets of Argos, there is no triumphal celebration, only a profound and oppressive silence. The victory feels hollow, and the news swiftly spreads. The most feared army of the Mediterranean has been defeated. The once invincible force of Pyrrhus dissolves in the span of a single morning. Pyrrhus of Epirus has fallen. He was only 46 years old.
Throughout his life, he had relentlessly pursued war, journeying from Macedonia to Italy, from Italy to Sicily, and then to Sparta, always seeking the next battle. He believed that peace was just beyond the horizon, waiting after the next victory. But that elusive peace never arrived. His endless pursuit of warfare had consumed him, leaving behind a legacy of ambition and tragedy, emblematic of the relentless, often destructive, human desire for glory. His body is consumed by flames on the funeral pyre, as Argos stands in silent mourning. The smoke billows upward, ascending into the heavens, only to vanish as swiftly as his many victories had once seemed unstoppable. The city of Tarentum would soon fall into Roman hands, succumbing just a short time after his death. Sicily, too, would be swallowed by the relentless expansion of Rome and Carthage, while Macedonia continued to bleed and suffer from ongoing conflicts.
All that Pyrrhus of Epirus had accomplished, his sweeping conquests and legendary campaigns, disintegrated the very moment his heart ceased to beat. But what is the true legacy left behind by this formidable titan of history? What remnants of his life and deeds endured beyond the engulfing flames and dust of his final battle? These questions are about to be answered, revealing perhaps the most profound and brutal lesson of all. Because as the smoke from his funeral pyre disperses into the air, the Roman historians begin their narrative, not to celebrate Pyrrhus's glory, but to interpret what he has inadvertently taught them. He, in his tragic grandeur, became the harsh instructor that Rome desperately needed to understand itself. Unbeknownst to him, Pyrrhus did not arrive in Italy with the intention of destroying the Roman Republic. Instead, he came as a catalyst, a forge that would shape its future.
The ashes of his funeral pyre in Argos gradually cooled. Yet the influence of his campaigns and the echoes of his presence continued to resonate, especially within the heart of the rising Roman power. As news of his death crossed the waters of the Adriatic Sea, the Roman Senate did not erupt into wild celebrations or drunken revelry. There were no drunken parties in the Forum, no drunken singing to mark the passing of their formidable adversary. Instead, the response was one of solemn gravity. The Roman senators, the architects of the Republic's destiny, comprehended the significance of what had just transpired. They had faced the greatest general of their era, an heir to the Macedonian war machine, a man who had made the world tremble with his military prowess. And they had forced him to retreat, to depart from the stage of history. This was no ordinary defeat. It was a decisive moment that would shape their future course. Pyrrhus had served as the ultimate test for Rome.
Prior to his arrival, the Roman legions had only engaged in combat with neighboring tribes, Sabines, and Etruscan city-states in small-scale skirmishes. Their experience was limited, their battles localized, their understanding of war still in its infancy. The arrival of Pyrrhus, with his formidable armies and innovative tactics, transformed their perspective. He forced Rome to confront a new level of military challenge, one that demanded adaptation, resilience,
and strategic innovation. In essence, he was the final exam that would determine whether Rome could evolve into a true imperial power capable of facing the greatest adversaries the world had to offer. Pyrrho, the king of Epirus, was a man whose military campaigns and strategic mind inadvertently reshaped the course of history. His arrival on the scene introduced the world to the brutal realities of warfare at its most relentless. He taught his adversaries how to endure the crushing weight of elephant-mounted armies, how to maneuver against seemingly impenetrable phalanxes, and how to withstand both tactical genius and logistical resilience. His campaigns were not merely battles. They were lessons in perseverance and adaptation, pushing the limits of what armies could endure and achieve. Rome's victory over Pyrrho was not achieved because of superior intelligence or cunning tactics alone. In truth, Rome triumphed because of their unyielding stubbornness and relentless perseverance. Pyrrho, for all his brilliance and aggressive campaigns, failed to grasp a fundamental truth. Each time he vanquished a Roman legion, he was, in fact, training the next. Every victory, while momentarily glorious, served as a brutal sharpening stone for Rome's future conquests. Unknowingly, the Epirot king became the catalyst for Rome's transformation from a regional power into a formidable empire capable of global expansion. His relentless pursuit of victory, driven by a fierce desire to surpass Alexander the Great, ultimately laid the groundwork for Rome's rise. Within mere months of Pyrrho's death, the world began to shift once more. Egyptian envoys, having witnessed the decline of the man they considered the new Alexander, traveled to Rome to forge diplomatic ties. It was clear that the Mediterranean world had simply elevated a new alpha predator, a force to be reckoned with on the vast stage of power and conquest. Yet, what remained of Pyrrho himself, the man who once dreamed of surpassing Alexander, was left behind in the shadows of history. His kingdom in Epirus, exhausted from decades of relentless warfare and offensive campaigns, started to crumble soon after his demise. Pyrrho's dynasty, once vibrant, was destined to vanish amid bloodshed and treachery. Unlike other rulers, he left no lasting laws, no monuments to his achievements, and no stable empire to inherit. His legacy was not one of construction, but of destruction. He was a compulsive gambler, constantly sitting at the great table of history, wagering entire armies on each hand dealt to him. He celebrated victories at places like Heraclea, Asculum, and even across Sicily. Yet he never learned the crucial moment to step away from the table and claim his winnings. Instead, he kept pushing the chips to the center once more, searching for that perfect bet, only to be ultimately left with nothing as the house, history itself, reaped all the gains. Pyrrho's life can be summarized by a cruel paradox that still bears his name today. A relentless pursuit of greatness through risk, with no thought of the consequences until it was too late. His story is a haunting reminder of the peril of overconfidence and the destructive nature of obsession, illustrating how a man driven by the desire to outshine even Alexander the Great can inadvertently become a catalyst for the rise of a greater empire.
Victory is not merely achieved through defeat. Rather, it often signifies the triumph of the ego over the stark reality of the situation. It embodies the inability to recognize that the price of success might ultimately lead to one's own ruin. This profound truth plays out in the tragic end of Pyrrhus of Epirus, who, after countless battles, met his demise not at the hands of a formidable hero's sword, but rather due to a simple, seemingly insignificant act, a thrown tile from an elderly woman, coupled with the dirty blade of an anonymous mercenary. Such an unworthy ending is a stark contrast to the grandeur associated with a demigod.
Yet it stands as the only conceivable conclusion for someone who lives his life driven by violence and without a clear purpose. The man who once had the potential to command the entire world ended up owning nothing, neither wealth nor power, not even his own grave.
As the mighty city of Rome begins to rise, preparing to march against Tarentum and to silence the chapter of Greek independence in Italy, the shadow of Pyrrhus gradually fades into obscurity. His fading presence leaves behind a timeless warning inscribed in blood across the soil of Europe, that victory achieved at the expense of one's soul, army, and future is ultimately hollow. Winning a battle without considering what is lost in the process, be it morality, integrity, or long-term prosperity, serves no true purpose. In the end, no triumph can justify the cost of losing oneself entirely.